Hello, Channel Automation podcast listeners. Welcome back to another deep dive into the techniques that convert leads. I'm your host, KC Urias, and today I am joined by Gerry Christensen with Caller ID Reputation. Thanks for joining in, Gerry. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having us, Casey.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. So tell me a little bit about Caller ID Reputation and how does it work to increase connection rates?
Absolutely. So, Caller ID Reputation is a company that has a SaaS-based service that allows businesses to manage their number reputation. And by number reputation, what I mean is telephone number reputation in terms of how the analytics engines view that telephone number as far as how they're used. And another important thing that we provide is not only visibility into the what is happening, which is what I was referring to a moment ago. How are the analytics engines viewing those numbers from a scoring perspective? But also we provide visibility into the what is happening. And that's the really important part, which we'll touch on here in a moment. The what being, is there adverse call labeling that occurs? And Casey, you've probably experienced that yourself. You might receive a call that says spam, or maybe it says scam likely. And those types of things are done, of course, from a consumer protection perspective. But the unintended consequence is there's actually legitimate businesses out there that have those kind of labels and shouldn't be getting them. So our SaaS-based service is for businesses of all sizes, SMBs to large enterprise, everything from the proverbial Joe the plumber to any kind of a large enterprise and everything, and all types of different applications, to everything from CRM to telemarketing. And what it allows our customers to do, as I was mentioning a moment ago, is have visibility into, are their numbers such that the analytics engines view them as something that should be labeled? And if so, do they actually get a call label? We will let them actually see that when they log in, so they could actually see a visualization, a snapshot of a telephone, and they would literally see what their calls look like on T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon when they're placing calls. That's the what is happening, as well as I was mentioning a moment ago, why, to be able to see how are they scored by the various analytics engines. And I can do a deep dive into all that, but that's kind of the high level of what we do.
That is super cool. And I'll tell you, as somebody who was already sort of in the business of trying to get the best connection rates for our clients, I got to say, that's technical. And a lot of the clients that we have lower connection rates with, because we can detect when the call is not being completed or when the text isn't being sent. It's just simply that, where it's okay, well, we can try a couple of other things, or you can get a new phone number, but how do you know, what do the labels itself mean? Because if that's finally being shown to somebody, what are we looking for? How do people as a business keep from getting their phone numbers flagged as spam?
Yeah, exactly. So if we step back at the 50,000 foot level view, or even further than that, let's go to the 100,000 foot level view. If you're a telemarketer, and telemarketing, of course, is what we think of most of the time, because they place a lot of calls and they may have a first party relationship or maybe a third party relationship with the customer. Although there's some interesting ruling that just came out with the FCC. We can talk about that as well if we have time. So that's what we think about mostly in this regard. But I would say even CRM and other types of use cases, at the 100,000 foot level view, it's all about, are you getting the call completion rates that you're expecting, that you're wanting? Call completion meaning that your call is presented to somebody, they have an opportunity to answer it, and they actually answer it. Now, the reasons why people don't answer calls where they have an opportunity to answer it, that's a completely different issue. Like maybe I see the caller ID and it says that it's a local car maintenance facility, and I've got no interest in that. My car is currently not being fixed by somebody. My car is not broken down. I have no idea why they're calling. I just ignore that. But given that it's not a spoof call and it really is a local maintenance facility, I at least have information there to make an informed decision. But again, at that 100,000 foot level view, for your listeners out there and anybody that might be watching this video, if we do some video snippets, I would say that's where you start from. So we at Caller ID Reputation, we don't get into issues like consumer preference and why would they answer one call versus another based on the context. What we get into is that sort of second layer. does the consumer even have a reasonable opportunity to answer that call? And there's a lot of things that could affect that. One of the things we touched on already, which is the call labeling, but there's actually a lot of different things. There are potential network problems. And I don't want to get too technical here, but voice over internet protocol, which is what most callers use today to be able to place calls at scale, both the white hats, the good guys, so to speak, as well as the black hats and shades of gray in between, all use VoIP to make calls at scale because you can make calls very inexpensively and very quickly that way. So there's a lot of unintended consequences as a result of using VoIP, not the least of which is the bad actors can sort of have anonymity and hide behind things. One of the other consequences of it, one of the things that actually makes VoIP really cheap is something called least cost routing. Least cost routing basically means that you have multipath. Your call doesn't just go on a deterministic path from point A to point B. It could take any number of different routes to ultimately get to the terminating carrier that can deliver the call. So one of the other things that can happen in addition to call labeling is your call could be diverted or blocked. Now, sometimes that's for good reason because maybe it's really an illegal call and maybe an intermediate network operator determines that somehow, typically based on their own usage behaviors and analytics, but it could also be through a third party, such as one of the analytics engines that we work with, where they determine by some means, based on reason and belief, that the call is illegal, in which case they have the legal right to block it. If on the terminating end that's discovered because you don't have latency issues like you would on the intermediate side, you may not block it, you may divert it. And by diversion, I mean typically it's like an IVR captcha type thing to see if it's really a human being or to see if it's a robot. So there's a lot of things to consider with respect to call completion, or as I was mentioning, the opportunity to complete a call to somebody. And those are the kind of things that we focus on. So from the onset of this discussion, I was referencing the call labeling, but one of the other things that we advise our clients on increasingly is whether or not we think their calls may be blocked or diverted, which is another important thing because if it's blocked or diverted, there's not even any opportunity to answer the phone because I could imagine if somebody gets a call and it says spam, they might answer it anyway. Probably won't, but at least have a chance to. But if it's blocked or diverted, I don't even have an opportunity to answer that call. Does that make sense, Casey?
Yeah, because the call doesn't get to you in the first place. So there's nothing to answer.
Exactly.
And it is interesting because even when I get phone calls from like really large companies like Spectrum or even like government companies, it is flagged as spam or scam likely because they are making all of those VoIP like massive call coming out kind of actions, and even those guys they don't even take steps to like reduce what it says on caller IDs, and I think that's really interesting.
So before we get back into caller ID reputation specifically and what we do, I think it's helpful for your listeners to have some additional context. And for some of your more sophisticated listeners, this is going to be something they've heard before. Hopefully, I can hit on some things that maybe reinforce their understanding or maybe some new insights that they might not have heard before.
And if you haven't heard this
But
before, you're not sophisticated. I'm just kidding.
okay. Well, that's not nice. I'm sure you've got some really smart listeners out there. So, two main threads of discussion about what makes this whole thing problematic, and this whole thing being the treatment of legitimate calls that are treated like they're bad guys or they're shades of gray when they should be allowed to go through unimpeded without having labeling, without having diversion or blocking. So the two main threads are one of the things in the industry that has been put in place that has had some success but has not alleviated the problem of the dark hats and the shades of gray is this thing called stir shaken. Now, stir shaken is an acronym, and sitting here today, I can't remember what it stands for because it's somewhat convoluted. I think somebody had a fetish for martinis, so they purposely made, they force fit it to be that acronym. But the stir part is authentication that happens on call origination, and the shaken part is validation that occurs on the terminating end, where they're using a certificate that is validated to confirm the authenticity of the identity that is associated with the call origination. Now, that's just kind of technolese way of saying it's a call that you can trust from a caller ID perspective. And so Stir Shaken has had some great, although limited, benefits. Case in point, I'm a Verizon customer. And it wasn't too long ago that I was on a conference call and I saw my number call myself. And I was thinking to myself, what happened there? Did I accidentally do that? And then I thought, well, it doesn't make sense because I think it would have gone to voicemail if I'd done that. I did happen to answer one of those calls. I think that's called reflective spoofing, by the way, where your own number spoofs. And so I answered it. Sure enough, it was a robocaller, and not the good variety. Not for your listeners out there, by the way, call spoofing in and of itself is not illegal. Public safety can do it. Police officers, battered women's shelters, stuff like that have good reason and legal reason to do call spoofing. But this was the unlawful variety because it violated the Truth of Caller ID Act, which basically says you're not allowed to attempt to defraud or otherwise extract anything of monetary value, including your identity from somebody. And that's what this one was doing. Since I answered that call, they called back repeatedly. I think somebody was messing with me. But anyway, that's kind of a personal anecdote. But that was pre-Stir Shaken with Verizon.
I want to add something on to that because I know a little bit about that whole reflective calling experience as well when it's like it's calling in from your own number. And even call centers have alerted us at Channel Automation. They're like, why is this happening? And most often what we experience is it is some sort of a scam because when you see your own number coming through, that is something that perks a lot of people's curiosity. So, especially with new AI and people being able to take your voice clips and then reiterate them in whatever way that they want, and then call into other, like, it could even be financial facilities like your bank, or they can call on your behalf to other people. Make sure that if you pick up those calls, do not say that much. Say hello, listen, and don't say anything else because you don't want them to get your voice. You don't want them to get your information. Just be very, very cautious about those kind of calls coming in.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Theoretically speaking, any network that has deployed Stir Shaken and is completely IP based, and by that I mean their entire network is VoIP. They don't use any of the old technologies such as Signaling System 7 and time division multiplexing, TDM. And that's actually one of the problems with Stir Shaken on a inter-carrier basis is there are so-called SS7 TDM holes where the information that starts with stir is not passed to the terminating side. So the shaken part can't validate the token. So basically, there's this thing called a token that's passed if it goes over a voice over internet protocol. It goes over a signaling channel called SIP, which is Session Initiation Protocol. And if that
Well, this is
chain
all
is not
drink based,
broken,
isn't it? That's hilarious.
yeah, I know, isn't it funny? Well, actually, SIP came out before Stir Shaken. So, but yeah, I didn't think about that one actually. That's right, Stir Shaken and SIP. Maybe they'll come out with Guzzle at some point. I don't know. Sometimes when I'm talking, people think I'm shooting with a fire hose and they're trying to guzzle what I'm drinking. So, what I'm serving them.
Us too.
Um, but yeah, I'm sure, and a whole different vocabulary. But getting back to that though, I suspect in the case of Verizon that they are completely VoIP, at least in my experience anyway, because I don't get those kind of calls anymore. I don't hear of anybody getting those kind of calls. Those types of calls I'm referring to being on a intra carrier, meaning it's all on the same carrier, that type of reflective spoof call. And what that means is that as a call is originated using a Verizon number, it's originated from Verizon, so it gets the best level of what they refer to as attestation. So that would be attestation level A, which means I know the network and I can associate the number with the network. That's A. And so once that's passed through the network via SIP to the far end, and we can validate that token, and we can see that it was an A at the terminating end, then we know that we can trust that call. So, stated differently, if somebody was to try to spoof Verizon with my telephone number, it would fail that process. It wouldn't get A level attestation. It probably would even be blocked, but it certainly wouldn't get to the point where I would get a call with my own number and it would really be somebody. Now, what you're referring to, Casey, where perhaps some of your call center is still seeing that, is either on an inter carrier basis where the token is broken because it's not SIP all the way, or perhaps it could be intra network where they have some internal TDM SS7 holes, meaning that even though it stays on the same carrier, it's not all IP. So the bad guys, by the way, the bad guys are smart. It's literally a criminal enterprise. They're at least as smart, if perhaps smarter than you and I. So we can't underestimate them. And sometimes they have insiders too that give them info. So I wouldn't be surprised if somebody knew that there was a hole there and they knew that they could exploit that, even if it's on an intra carrier basis. But anyway, I got way into the weeds there. Stir shaking has solved
Actually,
some
before you
problems.
go on to the next part,
Yeah.
when you're saying exploiting holes, I'm wondering if this has, and tell me if I'm wrong. I might be completely off track because I'm not an expert in this particular area. But when I sometimes get phone calls where the incoming call will happen, sometimes it happens with scam or spam likely, and I'll answer the phone anyway. There will be nobody on the other end. I'll say hello, there's nothing, and then they hang up. Do you know what those are?
Yeah, that could be for any variety of different reasons. Two reasons that come to mind immediately is it's just a network problem where the ability to present that information was there, but when you tried to acquire a voice channel because you accepted the call, that you just couldn't get a voice channel. It just wasn't available. And that can happen on a regular call too, where the signaling channel is available, but the voice channel is not available when you need it. But more likely than not, actually, is at the call center when you accepted the call. They use something typically referred to as an automatic call distributor, where it's not just one person calling you. You accept the call, and then on a rotation basis, that call is completed to somebody that's sitting in a call center. So it was probably that ACD, the automatic call distributor, that failed. And a lot of times there's latency there. Even if a connection does occur, it doesn't happen right away, which is actually one of the tells that you're dealing with a call center because it's not an immediate connection. You know, it's not a person to person call, you know, because you're like, hello, hello, and it finally connects. You should immediately have your antenna
And it
up.
makes that sound like whoop.
Yep. For any of you lay people out there, if you do one of those kind of calls, immediately be very careful, because you know it's not somebody, it's not KC calling me to have a chat. It's somebody that wants something from me.
This is all extremely interesting, and I know that even though I'm kind of sending you off in different directions, I'm just personally curious, and so I'm gonna like kind of pull it back to what like business and call center related people are looking for, which is how do you keep your numbers clean? How do you avoid getting on these spam likely flags that happen with carriers? Like, what are best practices?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to get to that. I'm kind of building to that because the next thing that I'm going to talk about is the other big problem, which arguably has become even bigger because of stir shaken, which is ironic because I liken robocalls, the unwanted variety, to water. They always find a way to go. Like you stick your finger in the dam where there's a hole, but if there's another hole, guess what? It's going to keep coming out even faster. Like I've got an engineering degree. It's actually industrial engineering. So I didn't really study fluid dynamics very closely, but I know enough to be dangerous. And I know that if you've got a flow and you've got various places for the flow to go, if you plug up one of them, it's going to come out with even greater velocity in the remaining holes. That's what we're seeing. So because of stir shaken being implemented, the biggest problem I would argue that we have right now is number rotation. And you alluded to it earlier. And sometimes we, as an industry, are our own worst enemies because I think that's one of the recommendations that happens out there is, oh, you're having problems with your telephone number? Why don't you just try a whole bunch more telephone numbers? I definitely do not recommend that because it's actually exacerbating the problem.
It also costs money.
And it costs a lot of money. And actually, it's as a result of that that the analytics engines erring on the side of extreme caution, knowing that there is number rotation happening out there. Sometimes it's completely good guys, white hats that are just trying to do their job. They've got consent. They're not violating TCPA. They're certainly not defrauding anybody, but yet they're rotating through numbers because they're pounding their head against the wall trying to figure out how to get their calls through. Because of that, the analytics engines erring on the side of extreme caution because they also know the bad guys are doing the same thing. What they are doing is they are labeling some calls that shouldn't be labeled. And I'm not going to disparage them because without these analytics engines, we arguably we'd have a lot of consumer protection problems. So we should all be grateful what they're doing. And I'll name some names here. I'm very grateful for First Orion, Haya, and TNS that operate with T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon, respectively. For example, the big three, because without them, we probably have a lot more people that are being defrauded.
We like them too.
At the same time, what I will say is if there weren't false positives being sometimes they put spam or scam on there, then caller ID reputation wouldn't have a business because that's what was the origination, the genesis of our business, was the anticipation that that would be a thing. 5 years ago, our founder, Joe Alcaraz, he said, I think this is going to be really important. We should probably build a business around this. He did, and here we are, and we're helping companies to deal with that.
Yes. And thank you for checking in. I mean, I might not be as you're very, very knowledgeable on your subject, and that's why I have you here, because it's like as soon as it starts to get a little bit too crazy, I absolutely will slow you down and be like, I am lost. I don't know what's going on. But no, I've been able to keep up with everything because you're very good at explaining and breaking things down. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Well, on the analytics side, another thing for your readers to understand at a reasonable level is there's, broadly speaking, two different types of analytics. One is event-based analytics, and the other one's content-based analytics. By and large, a lot of the AEs that work directly with the carriers, AEs are analytics engines, by the way, they deal in event-based analytics. And event-based analytics looks at discrete events, such as a call, and more specifically, things like how many calls were there. They don't necessarily get call detail records, so they're not necessarily going to know things like the length of a call, although they can sometimes, because if some of them are in a call path and are seeing these SIP messages, they'll see when the call attempt starts and then when the call is torn down, if it actually completes. So one of the things that they'll look at is call duration, the number of calls, call frequency. They'll look at things like could a human being place 20 calls per second, et cetera, et cetera. The other types of analytics is what's referred to as content-based analytics, where you're actually looking at the payload of the call, or if it's a text message, you're looking at what was stated in a text message. Now, for those kinds of analytics, you get some different kinds of insights because you can get more to that Truth and Caller ID Act type of stuff. You can look for things like, is this a caller that's saying that they're with the Social Security Administration, but then ask yourself some questions like, does the SSA really place these kinds of calls? And sometimes it's intuitively obvious based on the context that you can discern on a high probability basis that it's actually impersonation, which is a form of fraud. Other times you have to actually vet with the entity. Case in point could be, what if it's a caller or a texter that says they're with a bank and they're offering you a lower interest rate? That may legitimately be the bank that's doing that, because sometimes that might happen, right? But again, remember the bad actors are smart and they're shrewd enough to know what some of these enterprises are actually doing. So they'll do their best to emulate it and be received as that bank and try to trick people. And so sometimes it's important to do some vetting. So I'm going to bring it back to caller ID reputation. One of the things we strongly, strongly encourage everybody to do, every business, legitimate business out there to do, whether it's with us or somebody else that provides services like us, register your numbers. We can help you significantly if we know who you are, somewhat about what you do. We don't want to violate PII. We don't want to know who you're calling or any great detail about why or what you're calling, but just some context. Like, for example, if your business was KC LLC, you might register your telephone numbers with us and you might say, well, I'm in the healthcare services business. So all of my contacting is going to have something to do with healthcare services. So when we're monitoring calls that are received from your telephone numbers, if, for example, we use that content analytics that I referred to a moment ago, and we looked at the transcript from the pre-recorded audio that's left behind associated with your telephone numbers, and we see something in there about package delivery, and it says something like, you need to pay $100 to receive your package or some nonsense like that. Ding, ding, ding. We know that KC doesn't place those kind of calls, right? So that would be an example of one of the services that we provide our customers, is to give them some kind of alert if and when we ever detect. That would be an example of phone number spoofing, right? Because somebody is spoofing your number, they're using your number without permission, and even worse, they're violating the Truth of Caller ID Act because they're attempting to defraud somebody. So first and foremost, everybody out there that has a telephone number, and for all the call centers out there on a BPO basis, we highly encourage you to register your numbers, because then we can monitor them, as I'm alluding to, we can manage them, and then we can remediate them, which gets to one of your other questions, is how do we fix this?
Yeah, and one little tidbit that I want to add in is if you're already working with channel automation, you already know this, but this is why we focus so much right when we get like new clients and right when we're about to start a text and email and a phone call campaign with you guys. This is why we will not do anything until your phone numbers are registered and we know exactly what you are contacting people about, and why we're always hammering 10 DLC TCPA compliance and registration, because we do not want you to fall into this. This is a protective measure for you. And you can hear from Gerry here, like, this isn't something we made up. This is like what everybody is looking for when it's coming from making sure your numbers stay clean. Go ahead on the next part.
Absolutely. And so, in terms of best practices, I try to stray away from things like trying to tell people how many calls per day they should make to not, because quite frankly, I have no idea what the analytics engines in terms of their algorithms. I imagine they have some setting, right, that might get tripped if you make X number of calls per day or something like that. But quite frankly, I have no idea. So I stick to things that are reasonable and are within your control. And so those would be things like, don't do a number rotation strategy. Uh, Ideally, you will not be dealing with least short-term numbers, meaning that if you really want to be have the best chance possible to have your numbers, your calls answered, and your numbers not get ill treatment, use the same numbers, use them persistently, consistently, and don't share your numbers for different purposes. I think that's going to be even more important with this recent FCC order on third-party consent, which is it has to be one-to-one, it has to be conspicuous, and it has to be logically oriented to whatever the purpose was that you opted in. So for example, if I opt in because I'm interested in lawnmowers, if I get a call from some entity about pain medicine or something completely different, then that would be a violation of what the FCC has ruled on this week. And so if you think about that, it's probably not a good idea to use the same phone number to place calls about lawnmowers as with pain medicine, right? Because you may inadvertently be violating that FCC ruling. So the best thing to do is register your numbers, own and control the numbers, even if you're not the lawful owner of the number, at least long term, and use that number persistently, consistently for a long term. When you register them with somebody like Call ID Reputation, what we're going to do is we're going to set you up with a dashboard. As I was mentioning, it's SaaS based. You can log in as much as you want. You can go in once a day. You can go in multiple times a day, but it's refreshed once a day. And you can see the what. You can see if your numbers that you're using, when you place calls with them, do they get this type of adverse treatment? Do they show up as spam? Do they show up as a scam? That's the what. And what you can also see on that dashboard is the why, because we've got a bunch of different data providers. Some of them are the analytics engines themselves, and that provides you the why. And you might look and see that maybe on 2 of them or 3 of them, or who knows, that you have a high score, meaning that they think that you're spammy or even worse. That could give you an indicator that maybe there's a problem. And that problem may not be spam. It could be something worse. It could be maybe there's a violation of the Federal Trade Commission's telemarketing sales rule, which, by the way, one of many things that it says is that you must self-identify. Car warranty is a perfect example. Car warranty, it's not enough to just say, this is Gerry calling about your car warranty. No, that's a violation of the FTC TSR. You must say this is Ford Motor Company or some company that the called party can identify with. The other thing you're supposed to do is provide a valid callback number for opt-out. And this is associated with the pre-recorded audio that's left behind on an answering machine or an answering service. If you don't do those things, that's an FTC TSR violation, and that could be cause for you to actually be blocked. Not even just labeled, but maybe blocked. So I'll bring that up because there could be some things that once you register and Caller ID Reputation is monitoring your telephone numbers that we see and you can be advised of to make a change. One of the things I advocate is you follow sort of a triage process. If you can rule out that there's no outright fraud, and by the way, anybody that registers their numbers with us is highly unlikely to be a black hat, because why would you register your numbers if you're a really bad guy, right? We still look for it though, and we still rule out if there's any problems. And then we look for other unlawful things like the TSR I was mentioning. And the final thing is it just considered spammy for some reason? That's the process that we go through for our remediation customers, which do pay an extra fee, which is a managed service on top of the SaaS-based offering. And what we do is we act on their behalf. We have an LOA, so we have a letter of authorization to act on behalf of our customers, where we will take this information make an informed decision and present that to the analytics engines. And when we go through that triage, we can factually say, this is not fraud, this is not unlawful. However, it perhaps is being treated as spammy. We don't know why. That could be because of a certain amount of crowdsourced feedback where people just don't want those calls. Maybe, who knows? It could be for other reasons. It could be they flipped the switch, like I was saying. It's a total shot in the dark. Does 1,000 calls make it go off? Does 10,000? Maybe it's a number that wasn't used at all, and all of a sudden 20 calls, and then that, who knows? Don't even try to figure that out.
In the home improvement industry, I'm sorry to like cut you off there, but in the home improvement industry, this is why so many numbers get flagged, because the FCC is not an expert at your business. They cannot be an expert at every single industry. It's impossible. But let's say that you register saying, I'm a home improvement business. What we do is we replace cabinets, we work on bathrooms, we do full exterior remodeling and interior remodeling. And maybe you're calling a client that is signed up with you for water purification. This is just a small part of the home improvement company, but the FCC is not going to know that. So you may want to have a designated line specifically for your specialty products, is what, like, I to wrap it up.
That's brilliant, Casey. That is a brilliant recommendation. That fits exactly with what I just said. Don't lease, don't rotate, don't share numbers for different purposes. I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the things. If you want to be really careful with this recent FCC ruling, you should probably have a separate line for those different segments within the same conglomerate business, so to speak. That's an excellent recommendation.
Well,
Yeah.
thank
So
you.
yeah, it's very, very good. So you got the gist of, and hopefully your listeners may have generated more questions. And if so, please feel free to reach out to me or reach out to Caller ID in general. But that's the gist of what we do. We actively monitor and manage telephone numbers on behalf of our customers. We have a DIY version of it, and then we have, for a little bit of extra money, a managed service version where we can remediate when that's necessary with the analytics engines. And that's it.
One last question for you before we start to wrap up for today. And by the way, I do want to reiterate that if you are trying to get in contact with Gerry or with Caller ID Reputation, we are going to have that information listed in the description. If for some reason you aren't able to still find out where they are, you are absolutely welcome to reach out to us as well, and we'll point you in the right direction. So, one thing I wanted to ask before we kind of wrap it up for today is caller ID reputation relevant to a regular consumer, or is this something that is 100% for businesses? Like, what is the small, what is the big level of somebody who would need to use caller ID reputation?
We are very relevant to consumers, but in an indirect way. And by that, I mean, I feel strongly that years from now, what is going to make people actually answer calls is not just going to be eradicating the bad guys, it's going to be instilling trust in good calls. And by that, I mean not only cleaning up the telephone number in terms of not having adverse labeling and those types of things, but also there's other things that we just don't have time to talk about, which maybe we could do this in another one. Things like branded calling. And there's even different versions of branded calling. There's something called RCD, which stands for rich call data, where if you use that stir shaken thing I was talking about earlier and you get that A-level attestation, you can have things like not only the logo of the call, and also maybe a special, pretty thematic view on your screen of the color scheme that
Oh, I
company
love
uses.
that. I didn't even know that was possible.
These are basically prompts, ideally, to the user so that they know they can trust a call and that they have some context. Because the other thing that can be part of that RCD is the reason for the call. So, for example, this is totally hypothetical and off the cuff. ADT, the monitoring company that monitors for your alarms. One type of ADT call may be, hey, do you want to upgrade your system to something bigger and better, right? And another one might be, your alarm's going off. So one has a much greater sense of urgency than the other, right? So these are the kind of things, to answer your question, is highly relevant to consumers in the long game, because once consumers truly trust legitimate business calls and they can identify them as such, it'll elevate the value proposition for call centers and everybody else in the ecosystem, and it will literally squeeze out the bad guys because they won't be able to take advantage of this arbitrage where they pay micro pennies to place calls and they're counting on stealing money from grandmothers and so on and so forth. They will get squeezed out because they won't be able to play anymore because it'll only be good guys. That's how it's relevant to consumers.
That's very, very well said, and I'm sure that I mean, as you said, these scammer guys, like maybe once you get them on the phone, they're saying that they're a prince of a foreign country, and it's not like the average person's going to fall for that. But especially with like new AI, the way that they're able to scoot around, like you said, like plugging in the dam, they're going to come through maybe another way. Just be careful and be mindful of what kind of calls that you're getting, and that's the ideal goal, is to get these bad guys away from people calling and making the good guys look bad. You want to make sure that when you are calling somebody with the purpose of contacting them in relation to your business because they filled out a form or because they inquired before, you want to keep your number as clean and as specific to your purpose as possible, just to kind of wrap it all into a nice package here. So that's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
going to be it for us today. Thanks again, Gerry, for joining in. Whether you love or hate what we talked about today, we do want to hear from you. So make sure to comment or shoot us an email at hello@channelautomation.com. Also, please consider subscribing to this podcast and continue getting tips on marketing and call centers. As always, keep that lead conversion high.